Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, I think. No, good morning. Good morning. Yeah. Jet lag. I don't know if it's morning or evening or it's. Welcome, everyone. We're so glad to see you here to join us for our symposium, which is on social-semiotic and functional approaches to language and content integration. Okay. The background and the aims of this symposium. We all know that we're involved in different programs which have different labels, different titles: immersion, dual language education, content-based language education, content and language integrated learning, CLIL. But we all face very similar challenges, and the main challenge, perhaps, is that of the integration of content and language. So wherever we go, we're talking about ways of integrating content and language. Many of us, for the last few years, have been interested in what we can call broadly a social-semiotic and functional perspective on meeting this challenge of integrating content and language. So the aim of this symposium is to bring together colleagues from around the world who work in different programs, different institutions, different contexts, but we all share an interest in social-semiotic and functional perspectives, to be explained later, of course, what these actually are, on content and language integration, in order to move forward our understanding of content and language integration in bilingual education and to improve our practices. Okay, so why social-semiotic and why functional? Well, this view of language and linguistics sees linguistics as a kind of semiotics, as an aspect of the study of meaning. So it's a view of language which puts meaning, it forefronts meaning, okay? It's all about meaning. It doesn't mean we are not interested in form, but we put the emphasis on meaning. And language is seen as a kind of semiotics, as a kind of system for the creation of meaning. Why social? Well, we see social systems or cultures, and by this we mean, for us, educational cultures and educational systems as systems of meanings. And we put a lot of emphasis on the relationship between language itself and social structure. So it's a view of language which allows us to make these connections between language and social structures. Why functional? Well, function in its simplest meaning is language in use, what language is used to do, what the purposes of language are. But not only that, but function is seen as a fundamental property of language itself, as how the semantic system evolves and how languages are themselves organized. And here we're drawing on the seminal work of Halde and Hassan, going back to 1989. Okay, so what does this tell us about education and learning? How can we apply these ideas to education and learning? Well, it seems obvious to say so, but the social dimension is significant for educational questions. Yeah, we need a view of language and communication which is social in its orientation if we're going to look at educational problems, as education and learning takes place in social institutions, such as schools, of course. Knowledge is transmitted in social contexts through relationships between people, such as teacher and student, but also, of course, student-student relationships. Where do words get their meaning from? Well, we can say that words get their meaning from the activities and the tasks in which they are embedded. And then these tasks are social activities, and the people who are involved are social agents with their own goals. Again, drawing on Halde and Hassan. The father of this approach, of a social-semiotic approach, or of a specific type of linguistics, Systemic Functional Linguistics, or SFL, as it will be referred to quite often during the rest of the morning, is Michael Halliday. And he has a view of learning as essentially a semiotic process. And we see this term languaging, which has become quite popular more recently in the work of Yuen, for example. So learning an academic subject can be seen as essentially a language matter, or a matter of learning patterns, semantic patterns, or patterns of meaning. And if we use this understanding of language, then we can get to modeling processes of learning itself. And also, in turn, we can hope to increase our still quite partial understanding of language itself and perhaps language development of our learners. This is not new stuff. In general education, there are many researchers and practitioners interested in a functional approach or systemic functional approach to the language of schooling, to language in general education. Notably here in the United States in the work of Mary Schleppergrell in her book, The Language of Schooling, 2004. But also for those of us who are interested in second language learning and language acquisition, social semiotic perspectives are starting to become more prominent among second language researchers, and this is also notable in the work of Heidi Burns and Lourdes Ortega. So we can see a coming together of interest in social, systemic, and functional perspectives, both in general education and in language L2 studies. And we see that immersion and content-based approaches can be a meeting point for these two perspectives. Okay, so I'll hand you over to Anna, who will carry on talking about systemic functional linguistics and CLIL specifically.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, just to clarify what we mean by CLIL here, we're not referring to a specific type of program. We know that there are CLIL programs in Europe and in Asia, and CBI programs here, immersion programs. So we are considering CLIL as a content and language integrated approach to learning and teaching, okay? And interestingly, there has been very little of systemic functional linguistic approaches to CLIL, but recently, there have been some books that have been published that have a systemic functional approach to content and language integrated learning. The first two, The Roles of Language in CLIL and Languages Across the Curriculum and CLIL in English as an Additional Language Context, that include quite a few suggestions for teachers and teacher educators on how to sort of understand how content and language are best learned and taught in integration. And the two below are very, very recent. The one on conceptualizing integration in CLIL and multilingual education, edited by Tarja Nikula and colleagues, and some of us have participated with some chapters using systemic functional linguistics in understanding content and language integrated learning. And the one on the right, Applied Linguistic Perspectives, is coming out in February, okay, with a whole section on systemic functional linguistics. Right. So let's now stick to our papers. We're very happy to have papers, contributions from different contexts. Now CLIL, I'm using CLIL here to refer to the specific type of program, CLIL programs in Hong Kong, by Angel Lin, the presentation by Angel Lin and her colleague. CLIL programs in Europe, we have examples of studies on CLIL programs in Spain, in Austria, and in Finland. And dual language programs in the US with a presentation by Sabrina Sembiante and colleagues. Right. So all these papers have some kind of systemic functional linguistic approach to the understanding of content and language integrated learning. For example, a couple of papers focus on the concept of meta-functions, the idea that we learn the language or any language because we want to convey certain main functions, okay, to express ideas, to interact with the others. And another interesting concept in SFL is the concept of grammatical metaphor, nominalizations. And Angel Lin's and Yuen Yilou's paper will deal with some of this in their analysis of genres and registers. And also genre and register theory with field, tenor, and mode. I'm not going to explain these concepts here because they're going to come up in the different presentations, but there are two other presentations that deal with that concept. So different aspects within systemic functional linguistics will be covered in the different papers. But not only systemic functional linguistics, we think it's interesting to try to look for ways in which different models that are compatible somehow can be combined to get a better understanding of what we want to achieve, which is, understand how, or better understand how content and language integrated learning happens more successfully. And we have, for example, Angel Lin and Yuen Yilou will make use of legitimation code theory, which is very related to systemic functional linguistics. But then we have other models, usage-based linguistics, that has been used in the study of second language acquisition, not, as far as we know, not in content and language integrated learning. and see the connections between usage-based and so a cognitive theory with a more functional theory, as systemic functional linguistics. And then Christiane's new model of cognitive discourse functions in relation to systemic functional linguistics. So this is the schedule. After this introduction, we're going to have the different papers. We will have some minutes for questions after each paper. Thank you. And then we will have a final discussion run by Tarja Nikula, and there will be time for debate and more questions after this discussion. Okay, so now I welcome our first speaker, Angeline. Thank you.
Good morning. I need to put this on because of the strong spotlight, and my eyes are sensitive to the strong light. So I only have 15 minutes, so I'm a little bit nervous here whether I can finish everything. So I'll send you the PowerPoint if I cannot finish. Okay, I do. So this is our 09. And I won't have time to analyze all the classroom episodes. So here, drawing on Jim Martin's work on academic discourse, power words, technical terms, power grammar, grammatical metaphor, wordings with high semantic density. For example, spontaneous deamination is the hydrolysis reaction of cytosine into uracil-releasing ammonia in the process. So this kind of high semantic density, power grammar that Jim Martin calls power composition or power genres. So what it takes to survive and succeed in school, and especially if you think you are learning all of these in your L2, in your second language. So Carl Maton at University of Sydney, closely related to Jim Martin and Sue Hood's work, drawing on Bernstein's code orientations theory, horizontal discourse and vertical discourse. Basically, you can think of it as a sociological toolkit of frameworks for the analysis of classroom practice. I think I have to put this on, so please excuse me. Semantic gravity, the degree to which meaning relates to its context, especially the knowledge which is related to the context. So the higher the SG, the more meaning is dependent on its context. So a teacher in the CLIL classroom or in any content classroom can move from the abstract generalized ideas and concepts of the knowledge discipline towards concrete cases, as many teachers in the classroom would have done this, right? And we call this unpacking for your students. And weakening, we call this repacking, because you cannot just always talk about these concrete examples. You always also need to help the students to induce, to move back to general, abstract, generalized concepts from the everyday examples. Semantic density, the degree of condensation or crystallization of meaning within the socio-cultural practices of a discipline, of a knowledge discipline. So the stronger the SD, the more meaning is condensed, crystallized within these communities, within these practices of the knowledge disciplines. So again, in a classroom, the teacher, the CLIL teacher, can strengthen the SD when a large range of meanings are condensed into one term or one conceptual key phrase, usually as a technical discourse. And a teacher can also weaken the SD, for example, when the meanings condensed, when those technical meanings are explicitly unpacked and fleshed out with contextual examples. So Carl Maton considered these concepts, the SD, the SG, as one set of organizing principles underlying knowledge making. And we know that content and language learning is also knowledge making via language in the CLIL classroom. So another two terms from Maton, Carl Maton's framework, is semantic profiles and semantic waves to analyze pedagogical practices, classroom content delivery practices of teachers. Okay, so these concepts are just analytical tools to analyze. You can use it to analyze a lesson excerpt or a stage in your lesson or a whole cycle of lessons covering a unit of work. So just consider these sociological tools to analyze classroom practices. So semantic waves or semantic profile. For example, you have a conceptual term, which is cilia in biology, which are little hairs lining your respiratory system. And then the teacher can unpack the term into previously learned terms in the unit of work, and also everyday examples using everyday language referring to those phenomena. And then the teacher repack these everyday examples back into the technical discourse. So then you're starting high in the density, and then low, and then up. So you have a wave-like pattern, and Carl Maton calls this semantic wave. So here is an example to help you understand it. So teaching the technical term cilia, the teacher in the biology class, okay, what are the cilia? What was it? No? Do you know what cilia is? No, someone must know what they are. And then some students say, hairs. You notice hairs is not a technical term. The student is using their understanding. And then the student, the little hairs, and teacher first affirm their everyday understanding, the everyday wording, the little hairs. And basically they beat in an upward motion from inside your body out through to your nose. And the teacher is using gestures to help to unpack this term, the movement of this term. So they beat up and they take the pathogens away with them. And guys, so you see guys, emotional address terms, not emotion, but involvement address terms. Guys, I don't know if I've ever told you this, but when you smoke cigarettes, the tar actually causes your cilia because it's so heavy to drop, and so your cilia don't work properly after that because they are too heavy and they've dropped, so they can't beat the pathogens out of your body. So that's one reason that smoking is bad as well. Okay, all right? Write this down under description. So on the blackboard, the teacher is writing on the table, cilia, the technical term on the left column, and then the key nooks, and then a summary definition. So that's helping students to repack with the oral unpacking, the contextual explanations, and then the repacking to the technical discourse. So here, with high stakes reading, usually highly condensed, and then unpacking, making it less condensed and highly contextual, and then repacking it back to the high-stakes writing, the technical discourse. So you have this wave-like movement of the teacher's content delivery practice. But then if a teacher just does unpacking without repacking, then you have this, your students are stranded. They are stranded because they understand, but they can only express it in everyday contextualized language, but not in the abstract technical language. So using these concepts, we can analyze our own CLIL classroom practices. So, and my own rainbow diagram, I call this rainbow diagram, is within the classroom, your students will have L1 academic language and L1 oral language, and also L2 academic language, L2 oral language. And our purpose is to use all these resources to do the bridging work so that students can shift comfortably between these different registers. So here is the context of my classroom excerpt to share with you. In Hong Kong, we don't call it CLIL, we call it English medium, but most students are Cantonese speaking. Cantonese is their first language, English is the second or foreign language. And due to parental pressure, the dominance of English socioeconomically, so there's high pressure for parents sending their children to English medium classrooms, even though the students are struggling in terms of their proficiency in English. So this excerpt is taken from a biology class in grade 10. The focus is on protein. So the teacher has just finished explaining the structure of proteins. Now the teacher is turning to another key concept, the function of protein in building up body. So let's go through the transcript. Well, why do we need protein? Why do we need protein? So one student, bodybuilding. Louder, bodybuilding. Yes, for bodybuilding. Okay, so which part of your body? Okay, well, bodybuilding. And then writing on the blackboard the key term bodybuilding. Can you tell me which parts of your body are made up of protein? You can see this is the downward movement now, trying to connect this key concept to concrete body parts. And then student, bones. Well, okay, part of bones, right? I would like to say bones. Bones also contain a lot of minerals, okay? So part of bones. Anything else? And the student come up with hair. Now, all these are everyday words, not particularly technical. Hair. Hair. Okay, yes, hair. And another student, 手指甲, this is Cantonese, means nails, okay? The student doesn't know how to say nails. 手指甲. The teacher first confirms 手指甲. Okay, actually hair, the nail, and translate the Cantonese word into the English, the nail. Anything else? How about animals? Animals have, and the student, horns, yes, horns. Actually, they belong to the same class of proteins called keratin. Now here suddenly up, keratin, the technical term. Gok, chất chăn, which is a Cantonese word for keratin, gok chất chăn. That is L1 academic term. Okay? And also our skin. You know skin, they all contain the same type of protein. So next time when you eat deer antlers, this is a Chinese everyday term, expensive deer horns, endangered species that people spend a lot of money to buy to enrich their protein. And now when you don't have money to buy deer antlers, what can you do? You can bite your nail, okay? Just bite your nail. So the students laughed. Anything else? Now you see the unpacking, the downward move. So unpacking the very technical term keratin into deer antlers, deer horns, and your nails. So making it familiar, concretizing it, attaching it to contextual everyday knowledge of the students. Okay, so I won't have time to go through this. And then muscles. So people who want to build their body, they actually have to take in extra protein. What kind of milk powder? 有冇見過? Have you seen this? So social involvement strategy. 嗰啲 trans-languaging into Cantonese. 嗰啲食補充劑. Those people, because in Hong Kong, many people spend a lot of money buying those supplements. So and then teasing a student. So you have the potential. Can you show us your muscles? And then the student, I don't have any muscle. Okay, so it's downward movement. So here it is associating this bodybuilding function of protein with the students eating supplements, building up their muscle, so making it closer to students' everyday life and their concrete context. So you see this movement of up, the technical term, and then down, the unpacking. So our analysis of this teacher is he's good with unpacking using trans-languaging, but he doesn't do much repacking. So there are still chances that students might be stranded. So students will enjoy the lesson, find the lesson humorous, and will be able to associate the technical discourse with their everyday life knowledge, will understand the terms. But then when it comes to high-stakes exams, chances are students won't be able to repack their everyday understandings and examples into the highly abstract and technical discourse of the discipline. So I have another lesson excerpt from another teacher. And again, I don't have time to go through the excerpt with you. I can send you the PowerPoint. But I'd like to show you this beautiful graph, okay? That is, this teacher is physics teacher, physics lesson, and the teacher needs to unpack, to explain the highly abstract concept of the Brownian motion particle theory. I only have 1 minute. Okay, so we see that the teacher starts with this highly technical concept around the emotion, and then using everyday life example, the set word, using a lot of concrete multimodalities, visuals, and L1 explanations to do repacking, unpacking, and then repacking, helping students to jot notes, and then oral repacking, and then another example, unpacking, and then writing practice, helping students to have upward movement to repack the concepts into technical writing. So the ideal way of doing this content delivery is you have this wave-like structure instead of having this flat-like wave. So what's the implications of using semantic profiles? We can help teachers, give them meta language to analyze their classroom discourse. And also with translanguaging, we can analyze translanguaging in conjunction with semantic profiles to see whether translanguaging is just serving the unpacking function without serving the repacking function. Then our students will be stranded. Thank you very much. Roy, yes. Okay, the microphone is coming to you. I have to wear my glasses again. The light is just too strong.
You look like a rock star, so don't worry about it. It looks good.
In a previous lifetime.
Yeah, so I just, we were noticing the extent of the teacher talk and how little students are actually saying. And so I'm wondering about, the teacher seems to be doing really good modeling, and I'm wondering what evidence you might have that that there's uptake and students are picking this up, and what's their role in this?
Yeah, yes, this is also one characteristics of many classrooms that we have observed, a lot of teacher talk. But things are starting to change, there's more group work. And for these classrooms, when the students come to do the assignments, the actual assessment task, then we see that they really need to do the work. That is, they are not just sitting there listening to the teacher. So my colleagues in Hong Kong U, they have been trying out with small group discussion and other kinds of more collaborative learning approaches to science learning. So, but things are changing slowly. I think we can get more classroom data from that end later on.
Just so this is a model. What you're doing here is showing, you're analyzing the teacher discourse, but the underlying intention isn't to illustrate that this is facilitating learning. Or is
right, right. The delivery, the explanation of the concept. But I think in principle, the semantic profile framework can also be used to analyze group work. That is, you can have one peer unpacking a difficult concept for another peer. So it has lots of potential. It's just a toolkit to analyze. Whenever we speak, we are unpacking or repacking. That is, we are doing horizontal discourse or vertical discourse according to Bernstein's theory of knowledge making. So in science, it's a lot of vertical discourse. You need to build on the terms, technical terms. And the everyday life, typically we have horizontal discourse, lots of contextualized examples. So this repacking, unpacking, how to help students to shift comfortably between horizontal discourse and vertical discourse. So this toolkit is potentially useful for analyzing any kind of talk, including a collaborative talk. But right now I just have the teacher talk. Okay, so thank you very much.
I think we have one more question.
Okay.
Roy's question, I would like to ask whether you have applied this model to teacher training, teacher development, and then to see whether, you know, when teachers are trained into this repacking aspect that is missing in your study, whether there is a positive effect on students' performance.
Yeah, we are just starting the research. We've been working with a few case teachers. So with these few case teachers, one of my PhD students is using it. with this case teacher, and she typically hangs around this teacher, so gaining a lot of trust. And then we don't use these terms, very technical terms, but we use the graph. So teachers can easily understand the visualization. That is, we are dropping, we are going up. But yes, there's still a lot of work to be done to find out the potential of this work in teacher education. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, just a reminder that these sessions are being video recorded, and we will have PDFs of the PowerPoints online as well at the Carla website once all of this gets uploaded.
Are we ready to go? Okay, very good morning, everybody. I'm here presenting joint work that Anna Llinares and I have done together, but I'm going to present it all alone this morning because Anna is busy in other respects of the symposium. So our work here was about looking at how students get to express voice in their foreign language across different content subject tasks. Our rationale behind that was the knowledge that CLIL implementations in Europe are by and large typically content-driven, taught by content teachers, timetabled as content classes, assessed as content classes. And if you look at the curricular goals formulated for those content subjects, very often you find something saying that they should develop an explicit subject perspective vis-à-vis the curricular content, history, biology, whatever it may be. And this is how we understand voice in the context of this project. So our focus is to look at opportunities for students to express and develop voice in different CLIL implementations from Spain, Austria, and Finland. The premise behind this is that we believe, and there we linked up with task-based language teaching in a way, thinking that discipline-related tasks, in this case discipline-related tasks, shape language use. And in an earlier study, we looked at oral tasks as they are done in CLIL social science and natural science lessons, and you have got a list of such typical task types there on the slide, ranging from whole class discussions to games. One particular type of activity, individual interviews, was part of a research study that was interviews done by a researcher with students in a, well, not exam-like situation, but revising material they had covered. And we're using now two perspectives to look at those tasks and what the students do in them. That is cognitive discourse functions and the language of evaluation, i.e. appraisal. That is also a theory that has grown out of systemic functional linguistics. So we'll briefly introduce cognitive discourse functions, I will briefly introduce appraisal, and then look at some of the data. Now, cognitive discourse functions arise in classroom talk because content is being worked upon in the classroom, the aim being for students to integrate that into their cognition, changing the cognition of the students, basically. This being done through the mediation of language to a very large extent. And making for the content accessible for the students. Teachers use language, students use language with each other, but also making the cognition of the teacher accessible to the students and allowing the teacher access to the cognition of the students. And apart from solving mathematical problems or working with images, this is done with language predominantly in education. And where these three aspects overlap, that's where cognitive discourse functions are placed. That is the intention behind the cognitive discourse functions is to serve as a bridge concept between language pedagogy and subject pedagogy, You find them formulated in subject learning goals. Here is a list of such verbs that you find in curricula, and they're already grouped into baskets. I have tried to group them semantically, going into functional pragmatics, looking at the sort of the basic communicative intentions behind such performative verbs like classifying, comparing, identifying, hypothesizing, and so on, constructing a construct of cognitive discourse function consisting of 7 different categories. And it is this construct that we have applied to the data set that we are looking at. Appraisal. What is appraisal? Appraisal are those linguistic resources by which speakers or writers express evaluation, attitude, and emotion. And the quotation by J. Lemke, also representative of SFL, I think captures this very well. Part of what we do when we mobilize the evaluative resources of language is to help constitute our own identities as agents who believe and doubt, desire and detest, judge importance, and so on. That is voice. There are different types of appraisal. Attitude, expressing feelings, emotional reactions, judging behavior, or valuing things, illustrated with a couple of extracts from classroom interaction. I think he was a good king. He wanted to spread Catholicism. The economy is going worse and worse. The second type of appraisal, engagement, is going to be a very important one in our study, and that is ascribing, taking responsibility or ascribing responsibility, sourcing attitudes in the discourse, attitudes towards the content in our case. I think he was a good king. And then graduation would be about focusing in, focusing out, intensifying or weakening positions, like that would be focus and so on, or it was a very good army. So for the present study, our research questions were: what is the relationship then between these different kinds of tasks and the occurrence of cognitive discourse functions? Are there particular tasks where particular discourse functions are encouraged? And how is voice expressed by the students across the different tasks and discourse functions? And I already said different tasks we expected would frame the opportunities differently, and we also expect certain discourse functions to contain more expressions of voice. In particular, we were expecting to evaluate and explore to be particularly rich in that respect. In our so in this study, I already said we were looking at data from 3 European contexts, different types of tasks or activity types, also whole class. Activity types as they're usual in subject instruction. The students were in years 7 to 10. And we analyzed only the student language. In the analysis, we used the UAM Corpus tool, freely available to download, will be on the slides. In our first study published in 2015, we looked at only the different types of appraisal. And as you can see, the incidence of appraisal per 1,000 words ranges from 140 to just under 14, so the difference is to the power of 10, and there is clearly a group of task types that is much richer in the expression of appraisal on the part of the students than others. And when we now go to this particular study, applying the cognitive discourse functions using discourse or cognitive discourse functions as our analytical framework to the same data. So here we have got the 7 types of discourse functions from classify to report. we can see that describing is frequent across the board, which is also what we find when we actually analyze whole class interaction, also teacher language, by the way. Our cutoff point for boldening values was 2.8, and what you can see is that there is, again, a group of task types that has a wider range of discourse functions embedded in them, and it coincides by and large with the richer types of tasks in the appraisal analysis. And then in the third step, combining the viewpoints of discourse functions and appraisal, our expectations, I said, were geared towards evaluating and exploring function, and indeed those were the ones that showed the highest incidence of appraisal expressions of personal positioning overall, but as we found, also explaining is among the richer ones. We've brought a few examples from the data. The color coding is simply for the different task types. This is a group work sequence where Spanish students were looking at images from child labor in 19th century mills. You can see these are different types of appraisal, attitude, and engagement. I think is reoccurs in all the contexts a lot. This seems to be like a formulaic expression of, hey, here I am. I am now uttering my personal position here. Yeah. Or in the role play, you had a post-World War I dialogue between a German and a British soldier going on, where the students were expressing contrary positions. Or in Explore, which unfortunately is a very rare discourse function to occur both in the student interaction but also actually in whole class interaction. However, as such, when it does occur, it does have a high potential for allowing this positioning work. Linguistically speaking, what's interesting is of course, that one of the grammatical resources for doing this would be modal verbs, which for second language learners are one of the more difficult parts of English grammar to acquire. And you can see that in these relatively advanced learners, they're using can and not other modals. But that is something that we would like to continue working on, looking at the actual linguistic resources that learners use to realize those functions when they're working on curricular material. So our conclusions from this would be that different task types clearly trigger different types of appraisal and also different types of discourse functions, and therefore have different strengths. And some task types like group work do not fulfill all the promises they seem to hold on the surface. Some discourse functions seem to arise much more frequently without being explicitly orchestrated, like evaluate, whereas others, which maybe are very desirable also in terms of the explicit learning goals, seem to be in need of more planned orchestration on the part of teachers. One conclusion we draw, and something that we will need to work on, of course, is we think that it's important for teachers to be aware of the potential of tasks on these different levels, and we will have to work on how we want to sell this to CLIL teachers. In terms of next steps that we want to do is look at the actual lexical grammatical resources that students use, and maybe also that they would need guidance to use. So that would be explicit, the kind of explicit language work that might be necessary in the classrooms. Look at the development of the linguistic resources that students use longitudinally. But also look at the other side of the medal. Here we are talking about the content, the subject-specific language, but it will also be interesting to look at the social relationship side, so the non-academic talk that also is part of those activities, the interactions between people, between the students. What I would be particularly intrigued in doing is having a comparative study of students doing the same task, content-oriented task, in a classroom that they think, or that is labeled CLIL, so this is now geography, and then the same task in a class that is labeled, this is now our English lesson, and whether or not there would be differences in how they carry out that task. There are many links to task-based language teaching, giving also rise to heated debates about how to conceptualize tasks. What is a task? Thank you. That is a summary of our approach.
Do we have some questions?
So the tasks were very clear. What I'm wondering about is what happened before the task. So was there some modeling? Was there any use of sentence frames? Did the students have any support, or did you not measure that as a factor?
In reality, the CLIL context that went into our database is because it's really English as a medium of instruction, in the sense that the foreign language of the teacher and the students is used in the classroom, but there is no explicit language preparation, no sentence frames, nothing like that.
Other questions? Behind the pillar? Comments? Okay. I think you'll be ahead of schedule.
Okay, well, thank you. And who's next?
Okay, hello again. Right, the paper that Tom and I are going to present now is part of a recent research project that we are lucky to be running in the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. This is called TRANS-CLIL, because we're interested in the transition. It's called TRANS because we're interested in looking at the transition of primary school learners into secondary school learners, okay, both bilingual schools, CLIL schools, or whatever you want to call them. And we want to look at how this transition happens from different perspectives. So in this particular paper, we again are using systemic functional linguistics and Christiana's cognitive discourse functions to look at how learners, in this particular paper, we're looking at the primary school learners at the end of primary in Madrid schools, grade 6, how they express, so what their academic language looks like when they write about science and history in English and also in the L1 Spanish, because there is a lot of, let's say, well, there are lots of voices that argue whether the fact that these kids are learning science and social science in English is going to affect or not their performance in Spanish. So we wanted to look at their performance in Spanish as well, same kids, okay? Right, so this is an outline. I'm going to very briefly introduce the TRANS-CLIL project so that you have an idea of what the context is. Then very briefly, cognitive discourse functions and the systemic functional area that we have applied to this analysis, which is the concept of metafunctions, to help us look at the lexical grammar that these students use to express these metafunctions, logical connectors, how they connect ideas in a text, and the interpersonal metafunction, and then the methodology, results, and conclusions. So as I said, the TRANS-CLIL project has to do with the transition between primary and secondary. So we're interested especially in grade 6 last year of primary in Spanish schools, and then their first year in secondary schools. They move schools, okay, they change schools, and in the case of bilingual primary schools, they always have a sister school, let's say, secondary school, where these kids continue studying some courses and subjects in English, mainly in English. There are other languages, but 90% of the schools are in English. Right, so what is interesting in our context in the Madrid community, because of course Spain is very varied in terms of what kind of bilingual education programs there are. It depends on each autonomous community. But in Madrid, what is interesting is that the students, when they finish primary school, they have an external examination in English, okay, a common European framework of reference exam. Usually it's the preliminary English test, the Cambridge University Press. It's free for all the children, okay, so it's the costs are run by the community, and all children have to take that test. On the basis of the results, then they're streamed, they're placed in the secondary school in what is called a higher intensity bilingual program or a lower intensity bilingual program. This means that the so all students are doing some kind of bilingualism, let's say, bilingual education, but some of them do more subjects in English than the others. For example, the lower intensity bilingual study program, they have more hours of English than in an ordinary school, and on top of that, they have practical subjects such as arts and crafts or physical education in English. And the ones in the higher intensity bilingual section of the school, they do all those, and on top of that, they do biology, history, geography, and physics, chemistry, and English. Okay, so the difference is that they do more of what I call the hard science, social science subjects in the second language. So we want to follow the same students at the end of primary and see what happens after they have spent their first year in secondary school divided in these two groups, okay, with the different connotations that you can think of, and then give them a similar prompt and look at their academic language proficiency 1 year later. Okay, so in this study, we're going to show you some of the results that were obtained in the analysis of their performance at the end of primary, not in secondary. Okay, so the first time one. And the model that we're using is we're trying to link academic content, science, history, geography, the genres, the school genres, and the specific subject genres, and to really get to the lexical grammar. And if you attended Roy's workshop yesterday, we were, and also Laurent Camaratas, they were in both cases looking at this connection between content and then let's get to the actual realizations, okay, grammatical, morphological realizations of those specific meanings. And we think Christiane's model of cognitive discourse function is a nice way of linking the two, okay? So what do they need to realize in terms of discourse functions? Cognitive discourse functions to express this specific academic content, and how do they do it? So I won't stop here because you already know about the 7 lovely cognitive discourse functions. And just very briefly, the 2 meta functions that we looked at in order to see how the students performed through their lexical grammar is within the ideational meta function, the logical meta function, how do they construct logical relations to express the meanings that they're expected to express, and how do they enact social relations within the academic content that they are expressing. So our research questions were, which cognitive discourse functions are realized by these students when they are prompted on a certain topic? When do they perform them, and how much? So what is the frequency? How does the frequency and variety of these cognitive discourse functions that students are going to perform in a task relate to the results that they obtained both in this general English examination, external examination, and in another examination that all 6th graders have in the Comunidad de Madrid at the end of primary on social science, let's say, Spanish, and mathematics, and they all do it in Spanish, regardless of whether they attend a bilingual school or not. Of course, they do Spanish and math in Spanish, but these students in bilingual schools do science and social science in English, but still this examination, this external examination is done in Spanish for all the children in the Comunidad de Madrid at the same time. It's the same exam. So how do they correlate? So we have general academic knowledge, let's say, tested in this external examination. General English knowledge, let's say, tested in this PET exam. So, but how do they perform in academic? So what is their academic language performance? And how are these CDFs realized through the lexicogrammar? So we collected written and spoken data from these 6th graders, okay, at the end of primary, their primary education. And there were, we had 3 classes, 3 complete classes with 83 students in total. And we asked them to perform oral tasks and written tasks. In this particular session, we're going to focus on the written tasks. Every student did 2 written tasks, okay? 1 in English, 1 in Spanish, 1 on history, and 1 on science. And the prompts that we gave them looked like this. In this, you have there an example, segments from the 2 prompts. Of course, they had 1 prompt for science and a different prompt for the history, but we have here segments from both prompts so that you see how they are related to each of the 7 cognitive discourse functions. We wanted to see how they performed, of course, using a topic and knowledge that they already had, because we prepared these prompts with the teachers, okay? But trying to make sure that they addressed the 7 cognitive discourse functions and see how they addressed them. Just for your information, we found that the texts that they wrote were quite similar in terms of number of words in Spanish and in English. So they wrote text with a similar length, not many differences at all. We coded these students' realizations, these texts, by using Mick O'Donnell's One Corpus tool. So we coded each of their utterances according to the different cognitive discourse functions. And we also classified the students using this tool into 2 groups, depending on the mark obtained in the English proficiency exam and in the general academic examination. So we call them PET A or CEFR, Common European Framework of Reference A, the ones that obtained an A1, A2 in that exam, and then B, those that obtained a B1, B2. Okay, and in the other general academic test, remember that it was done in Spanish, and they were tested in math, Spanish, and science. We did an average, and the median that of the results that were obtained was 8 out of 10. We have a system of from 0 to 10. 10 is the top mark. So we divided them into 2 groups: those that obtained an 8 or more, and those that obtained less than an 8, because that was the median. Okay. So Tom, okay, this is what the coder looks like. If you're interested in knowing how it works, it's free, it's available on the internet. You can download it and work with it. Of course, you need to do, to learn a little bit about how to work with it, but it's free and you can use it for analysis. This is the One Corpus tool, okay, the type of coder that we used for the analysis. And now Tom is going to focus on the results following the different research questions.
Okay, so the first group of results are basically more quantitative. It's what happened when we compared the 2 groups using some numbers, and then the last bit will be slightly more qualitative analysis if we have time to look at a couple of examples. So when we looked at the English and Spanish results, and we looked at the groups who got higher and lower scores in the academic content test, what we did is we organized the use of the functions into a ranking. Okay, so if you look at the second table of Spanish, that probably more clearly shows the ranking, that evaluate and classify usually came out top, and definition usually came out last. Okay, And that's what happened. It was fairly stable. But we found, when we turned to English, we found some significant, statistically, some differences between the two groups' behavior. So we can see, for example, that classify was used significantly more by the group which had a lower score on the content test. And we also find that evaluation is used more by the group which had a lower score in the content test. But what attracted our attention here mostly was the behavior of explore. If you remember from Christiana's talk, explore was something that's not that common. But in our findings here from these written texts, we found that in English, the group which had higher content scores seemed to be using explore quite a lot more. And even if you compare between English and Spanish, the group in English were using explore more in English than in Spanish. But the group which had a lower score on the content test seemed to be happier to use explore when in Spanish. Okay, so we have the difference that seemed to emerge here seemed to center around explore. If we look at the language proficiency results on the Cambridge preliminary test, things are pretty much stable. No significant differences, roughly the same order with classify and evaluate on top. So it seems that the language proficiency scores seem not to be doing that much in relation to the use of the different cognitive discourse functions. We combined the results on the content test with the results on the English proficiency test. Again, we found in English that explore moved around. Explore was used significantly more in English by the group which had a higher score in the English test and a higher score in the content test. So we start to think, well, what's going on here with this cognitive discourse function of explore? Why is it the one that seems to move around a bit more and do things? So we looked at some examples of the students' writing, and this analysis is at a preliminary stage, but we're interested here in looking at the lexicogrammatical resources that the learners use to actually do some exploring. Exploring is quite a wide area semantically. Students are involved in doing things like hypothesizing, speculating, predicting, guessing, and probably they are operations which may be seen in terms of more higher order thinking skills, higher up in Bloom's taxonomy, for example. So we look at here are a couple of examples. For student 1 has a higher score in the academic test and a higher score in the English test, and student 2 has a lower score in the content test and the same score, a B, in the language test. And the students were asked to introduce a new animal into an ecosystem. So where would you introduce it? What would be the effects on the environment? What would it be like? And we found something we saw in Christiana and Anna's previous paper, some problems with the expressions of modality. So will seems to be overused instead of would, to express what the learners would speculate about doing. So we see that there's also some variation. The student does use would once, but will appears to be used much more often. Then when we look at the second column in history, if he didn't discover America, all would change. Well, that's quite a complicated thing to say. What would have happened if something else hadn't happened? So we're looking at a kind of a logical relation here, expressing conditionals. So we find, we expect to find this, and we find some problems in expressing these meanings. Also, we find this problem with can and could, which relates to the interpersonal function, which relates to engagement, as we saw in the previous paper. Students having problems in choosing the right modal verb to talk about what could happen, what might happen, about possibility. In Spanish, we also found that students had issues in talking about, in hypothesizing, speculating, and exploring, namely in the Spanish subjunctive. So, and if any of you speak Spanish, you'll be well aware of issues with the Spanish subjunctive. So we have here in the first student who has a higher score in the English test and a lower score in the academic test, has que España sea un país. So we have a present subjunctive as opposed to a past one, fuera. And we have issues with spelling or producing the conditional of introduce at the top there. So we found that even in Spanish, there were issues with expressing this function. So to conclude, rather quickly, we found that the rankings of the cognitive discourse functions were similar in English and in Spanish, with classify, compare, and evaluate being the top choices, define the least frequently used. Understandably, I think, because students only define when they are asked to define, like give a definition of something. General academic ability seemed to be more related to the choice of CDFs than the English level. More frequent and longer instances of explore and perhaps other cognitive discourse functions do not indicate a wider repertoire of resources to express the meanings. We had similar lexicogrammatical problems managing these resources, regardless of English and general academic levels, and also in the students' L1. But there were some more lexicogrammatical problems for those students with both lower English and lower academic ability. And just a quick methodological note, we think there are benefits of combining the more quantitative corpus approach with a finer-grained qualitative analysis using the tools of systemic functional linguistics together with cognitive discourse functions. Thank you. Gracias.
Questions or comments? Yes.
This is for Ana Llinares.
Yes.
I have a question in regard of what you were speaking about the sixth graders, and they're written at the end of, seems to me like a exit exam in English and in Spanish. And I have a question related to that. If there has been any follow-up as they go to other higher grades, like in high school, preparatory, or university, and if there is any follow-up in their performance in a social workforce in Europe. Perhaps it's a long question. Hope you had understood my question. Should I say it in Spanish?
Yes, I mean in terms of... Sorry, yes. Okay, we were interested in this transition from primary to secondary because really what we found in the transition from secondary to tertiary in our own project some years ago is that the students that really finish secondary education in a bilingual school, in our context, are students that usually are good students in general. They don't struggle. They're really keen on, they even have extra tuition or whatever. Their parents send them to, English-speaking countries to improve their English, and they have a lot of support. And there was yesterday in the plenary, I think, given by Ellen Bialystock, this topic arose. Every time we look at socio-economic aspects, we always see that these have an effect. So then those students that participate in bilingual programs, when they finish secondary, bachillerato, let's say when they want to enter university, they have to take an exam. It's called selectividad or PAU. And the students in bilingual programs perform as well or better, although the PAU is in Spanish, than the students who do not participate in bilingual programs. But of course, there is this, let's say, variable that these are already good students interested in, working harder because it's harder to study in two languages, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so this is... I don't know if I've answered the question. Probably not. No? Okay. Because... but I mean, if is there anything else? Yes?
Sorry.
No.
What I'm understanding is that what I'm asking if there's a follow-up and on the workforce and social, they are performing well.
They are performing
and
well.
It's my understanding that it's a continuation also in college.
Yes.
Very quick question before we move.
Okay, well, this might not be that quick, so we could just address it maybe later in the discussion. Mm-hmm. But so what, if I understand correctly, in English, the use of the cognitive discourse functions depended more on the learner's overall academic achievement or ability, yes, and not so much on English proficiency. So it begs the question, to what extent this is, why would this kind of focus help drive second language development forward? Like, isn't it a first language and second language issue and not specific to second language development?
This is a good question. What we find, well, the first, I mean, this is just fresh results, and what we are wondering is, you know, they dividing these children into these two strands on the basis of the results in the English test, thinking that they're gonna cope better with academic subjects in English. But we found that this does not really mean, I mean, having a B1, B2 in the English test does not correlate so well with their actual performance according to the cognitive discourse functions. Another matter is how they realize those cognitive discourse functions, because we see that all groups have difficulties, okay? As Tom said, the combination of low English and low general academic test was the one that really showed a lowest performance in terms of lexicogrammar. But otherwise, all of them have problems, and also in Spanish, similar problems. In English, the could, the would, the will, the use of the conditionals, and in Spanish, the use of the subjunctive to express this explore function. Okay, so they have difficulties in Spanish and in English. So one thing that, well, is interesting, I think, and I think, well, decision makers could maybe, I don't know, have a thought about this, is that having a really a very good level of English does not automatically mean that they're going to cope better in terms of academic language with the subjects that they study in English. In fact, it seems to be that the ones that are generally good students in general cope better with that than the ones that have a high level of English regardless of their general academic competence. So this is really new, but I think it's interesting to explore further and see how it goes. Thanks for your question.
Right, good morning, everyone. Let's see. There we go. Right. Well, starting at the very beginning, when we talk about academic language, one of the things that mostly comes to mind is Cummins' work, in which he defines academic language in terms of cognitive demand and context embeddedness. That is, academic language is highly cognitive and is context reduced or is decontextualized. Now the question is, how much truth is there to this idea of decontextualized language? Any text in any discipline is situated within the context of that discipline. So there is still a context even to decontextualized language, but more about this later. Then also the question, what about cognitive demand? Is the cognitive demand something that is inherent to the activity being carried out, or is it inherent in the language that goes along with that activity? I would say that it resides in both, since language here reflects what we are doing cognitively. So the more complex the activity, the more complex, obviously, the language is going to be as well. Now, when we're talking about academic language, this has been broken down by many authors. Bailey and Heretics, for example, do it in school navigational language, which is pretty much language for classroom management, and curriculum content language, which clearly has to do with the instructional content. Something similar going on with work done by Christie, which she puts into the regulative register, that type of language that has to do with regulating the classroom, and the instructional register that has to do with instruction. Scarcella, for example, breaks it further down into foundational language knowledge, which seems to be something BICS-like, and essential academic language, which really is the technical vocabulary, and other academic language words such as although and things like that. But basically what we end up with is lists of words. We have lists of technical vocabulary, lists of more academic vocabulary, but it never really, I mean, we all know that we don't learn language from a dictionary and a set of rules to go along with that. So a bit closer to text and to actual discourse is then what you could call academic discourse functions, whether you call them academic functions, as Cummins did, or academic language functions, cognitive discourse functions. It all turns around the same thing. It's particular activities, particular cognitive activities that are carried out in classrooms. And a bit more generally, work done in SFL on academic genres is pretty much saying the same in the sense that genres are staged, goal-oriented social processes. Well, it's always social, as was said in the introduction. Anything we do is social, but if we supplant social with cognitive, then we have indeed what these cognitive discourse functions are all about. Now, there is a problem, that is, how do you get from the vocabulary lists at the top there to actual text, actual genres? There is a big chasm in the middle. There is a big chasm between the structure of a text and the vocabulary that is used, the language, nitty-gritty that is used to fill out that structure, so to speak. So you might say that there's sort of a logical problem to academic language learning in the sense that a register, here the academic register, is distinctive in terms of the probabilities rather than the certainties, in the sense that a register, the academic register, still uses English, but it has different patterns from day-to-day English. And many of these features actually have to do more with grammar, the lexicogrammar, that is how words and patterns come together, than with vocabulary as such. But the problem is that we do notice words, but it's much more difficult to notice grammatical patterns. So how do we learn something which is actually made up, characterized, but something that we don't notice in the first place? The rest of the presentation is a bit towards that. Usage-based linguistics, in my opinion, is one step towards solving that particular logical problem. Usage-based linguistics is an umbrella term for all kinds of languages and all kinds of theories and approaches that start from the idea of language as something that people need to communicate. And language as such is something we build up, both what you might call linguistic knowledge as well as the development over time, is something we build up through concrete experiences, through concrete use in real usage events. And the idea, according to usage-based linguistics, of the symbolic unit of this language process, this language development, is what is called a construction, a form meaning pairing, any kind of form meaning pairing, whether we're talking about words, whether we're talking about larger patterns. You might think of chunks, how do you do, how are you, that kind of thing, conveys a specific meaning. But really, a construction is much more fluid. It goes beyond what's been called formulaic language. And language knowledge then is a structured inventory of all of these constructions, which we learn on a pattern-by-pattern basis. What is then conventionalized, what is used very often in a speech community, then also becomes entrenched in the minds of its speakers as language knowledge. To give you a quick example, imagine a mother talking to its child, saying, well, put it on the table. Child in the early stages of its development. And the mother says it again, same day, and then the next day, put it on the table. After a while, the child really knows that put it on the table has a clear, this form has a clear meaning to it. And put it on the desk. So, okay, so apparently the last slot is interchangeable. You can put different things there. You can put things on different things. Put it in the bag. Now we've got an interchangeable slot for prepositions. Put it on the bed. Put it in the trash, and so forth. What we end up with is the idea that put something in a location has a clear meaning to it and a clear form structure. Put something in somewhere, a location. Set it on the table. So apparently you can also interchange the actual action here. until you eventually get to metaphorical language use, such as "could you put me on the way to," which is the exact same thing, but in a metaphorical sense. So you end up with this construction of a verb, an object, and a location, which we use productively. Some people have called this a rule. I would say it's a pattern. It's a pattern that we learn on an instance-by-instance basis and then abstract from in the form of this particular pattern or construction. So usage-based linguistics presupposes an intimate relationship between forms and the discourse in which they occur. Constructions, then, as I said, are abstracted from usage events, and they maintain their link with the discourse context, in the sense that how we interpret whatever is said, we interpret it in terms of our experience with a certain discourse context, with a certain interactive circumstance. And if you have the same element, the same formal element, popping up in the same environment every single time, you create discourse expectations. To give you an example from a fourth-year primary school classroom where they were talking about the cycle of the frog. It's quiz time, the students have been talking about the cycle of the frog, and so the teacher is asking the students about, how are reptiles born? Okay, reptiles are born from eggs. Yes, reptiles are born from eggs. How do reptiles breathe? Well, reptiles breathe from lungs. This is, of course, grammatically incorrect. But the teacher says, yes, from lungs. This is important. This is the input children are getting. Okay, then one student has to explain the whole cycle. Okay, so they are born from eggs, then they breathe from lungs. Going on, from lungs, okay. Yes, you got it right there. Then, underlying in books. So the teacher says, well, underline breathes with lungs. She's reading from her own notes. This is the only reason why she has it correct this time. Because when a student asks underline, she says, yes, you underline breathes from lungs. I just told you. So, quiz time again. It's not about the mistake here. It's not about the grammatical mistake. It's about the input. It's about the frequency with which this particular construction is popping up. Reptiles are born from lungs. They are born from eggs. Born from eggs, yes. Sorry, well, here you go. Marine mammals breathe from lungs. Yes, okay, with their lungs. And then a student says, what's with? Because here in this context, the word with has no meaning whatsoever, has no logical meaning, because here the student expects from. There you go. And of course the student understands after, well, with a pen, it's like, okay. Anyway, so speeding up a little bit, the idea is that a construction can be really anything, from the pattern that I showed you in the beginning, put it on the table, to a small thing such as the word with, to a bigger discourse sequence. Think of genres in general. So here we have a unified approach that actually bridges the chasm between vocabulary and the larger generic structures. Because language, because constructions are schematized patterns of action. It's something we do over and over again. However large that action is, how many steps or stages that action contains. And Lemke speaks in this regard of regularly performed activity structures. Now, we're not talking about things such as group work per se, which is also an activity structure, but things like an explanation, a discussion. These are also activities. These are verbal activity structures, cognitive activity structures. We can analyze the usage events in which these activity structures occur as, in SFL terms, the context of situation, which is expressed in three variables: field, which is the design, call it purpose, goal of the verbal action; the tenor, which has to do with the relationship, the relation-based subcontext, how students relate to text, how they relate to propositions, but also to each other, obviously; and the extent to which verbal action is embedded within the immediate material situation. The distinction here being a demonstration of a chemistry experiment where language is ancillary to whatever is going on, and the recount of that experiment later on without any of the material context there. Doesn't mean that there is no context, but the context is now embedded within the language. The language is no longer embedded within the context as materially present. So verbal action, really, what is being done is the big denominator here. And if you take all of these activity structures in together using the tools that SFL gives us, then based upon work by Hassan, by Martin, by Jay Lemke, I put together this network of all types of activity structure, all types of cognitive discourse functions, but it also takes it one step further. It makes it more crystallized. It goes deeper into the nitty-gritty of what kind of language you can expect. And because of, well, recent events, I chose to focus on a debate as an activity structure. So, well, a debate is something where language is constitutive of the activity going on. Of course, you can settle a problem or any kind of disagreement with a fist fight, but we do this in words nowadays. Well, some of us at least. The thing here is that it's purely conceptual. There is no practical action inferred, there is no deferred practical action into the future. It's all conceptual. But in terms of how people relate with the content and with each other, it's a very relation-based activity. It's not so much a purely reflection-based activity in the sense that you provide an explanation. It is arguing with propositions and with people. And a debate in this sense is clearly directional because you're arguing for or against challenging an opponent. And this tells us something about the type of language that we can expect. To give you an example of a debate by a first-year group of secondary students in a history class talking about the War of the Castilian Succession, 1474, you have all this language such as I think, should, that expresses opinion. And it's the activity starts out like this. Students have prepared propositions. They haven't really prepared texts. They're not reading here. They're talking to each other. There is no interference by the teacher. There is actually just one student who moderates, who just simply points to students raising their hand to take the floor. So it all starts out with, well, I think that because, etc. People are not interacting really here per se. They're simply stating their point, their position. It goes on. Well, you know, but because also, and I think that. And then it gets a bit more interactive all of a sudden. Well, yeah, this refers to something said before. I think that Joanna should be the queen because, etc. And then first, well, I don't think that Joanna, and this then again relates to something that was said before. And then eventually it becomes really debate-like. Well, what Elizabeth said just before me, what Elizabeth said, that, etc. I agree with Sonia that students are doing this themselves. Roy Lister yesterday talked about autonomous practice. If we're talking about autonomous practice, this is it. Students are using this all on their own. No one has actually scripted this. No one has told them how to do this. This develops quite automatically. I'm going to skip this. So, in other words, if we look at activity structures as forms of constructions, then we can say that adopting a usage-based approach allows us to bridge that distance between lexis on the one hand and lexicogrammatical patterns on the one hand, since they're all subsumed under this idea of schematic constructions, however large the schematicity is. So constructions at different levels of schematicity then are really the units of language learning. And academic language proficiency then consists of accumulating these linguistic resources, these interactional resources and routines, as they are frequently used in the classroom and students are exposed to them, and thus become institutionalized. Think of breathe from lungs. This became institutionalized. This was how you talked about breathing through. So, in other words, concluding, students really do learn from the usage that they experience. And as such, it's really necessary that we pay attention to the social interactional language learning environment in terms of usage events, rather than in terms of sheer exposure from the teacher to the student. It's about the interaction between student and teacher and students among each other. So we really need to look at that interaction as a whole. Linguistic knowledge, linguistic development, and interaction then are not independent from each other. They really go together. So learning happens not in an intellectual vacuum, but in a real world where interaction matters more as more than just a site for information exchange, as many as lay theories would have it, but as a truly social environment from which language knowledge emerges through use and in use. Thank you very much.
Minutes for question, comment?
Thank you, Thomas. Very interesting work. I just would like to ask two questions. One is, so genres. How would you relate your activity structures to genres? The two concepts, conflating the two. The second one will be teacher education implications or language teaching implications using your schemata. Yeah. Implications for teaching.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Well, as for genres and activity structures, J. Lemke himself said, well, activity structures are spoken genres. And the idea that the genre needs to be a written genre, that there is no need to restrict it to that. It is, I mean, activity structures are staged, they're goal-oriented, they're social. Whether the activity carried out is one that is materially present or whether it's a purely conceptual activity, they all have steps. An explanation itself is structured, is cognitively structured. There is a causal link or there is a sequential link between things. So there is a structure there in the same way that genre has it. As for teaching implications, we're not saying anything new. I'm not saying anything new per se. It's just from a different perspective, a different theoretical perspective in this case. Things like input flooding in spoken discourse are definitely worthwhile. The more students use certain elements, the more they become familiar with them and the more they become entrenched. Teachers often give students a list of resources, 5 synonymous interactional resources to accomplish the same action. And then they see that students latch on to just one of them and they say, well, yeah, but why aren't they using all the others? But this is normal. Whatever works. I mean, if something works, then you keep doing it. And it's actually also only through doing it over and over and over again with this one resource that it actually becomes entrenched and that it becomes part of one's linguistic knowledge. Yep. Yep. Thank you. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. My name is Sabrina Sembiante. I'm going to be presenting my work with colleagues Andrés Ramirez and Luciana de Oliveira on bilingual academic language development for emergent bilinguals, and we're going to expand that term a little bit to emergent to advanced bilinguals. So the academic content that emergent to advanced bilinguals need to access in school is specialized and highly dependent on knowledge and use of particular language features. This demand becomes even more prominent in dual language programs where emergent to advanced bilinguals are called to access academic content in 2 languages. Content area teachers have the dual responsibility of facilitating their students' content learning while also supporting their ongoing bilingual development. Learning the content areas is highly dependent on reading texts. And as such, in order for general education teachers or these content areas teachers to support their emergent to advanced bilingual students, they need to understand the challenges, the characteristics, the differences in academic language, and also determine what challenges these may pose in the content areas for their students. Overwhelmingly, particularly in the US and elsewhere, pedagogical approaches towards or for emergent to advanced bilinguals have really focused on less linguistically specific techniques, strategies, approaches, such as keywords, generalized vocabulary, even graphic organizers. And the lack of reference to specific characteristics of language means that, or it leads to lack of access to the content knowledge in the text, and then a lack of access to understanding how language, academic language, indexes this content information. So the objective of our project is threefold. The first is to examine characteristics of academic language in general, and then to determine characteristics of that academic language in the content areas. So in particular, language arts, mathematics, science, and social studies. So we are looking across and within. And then to show characteristics of academic language and the differences in English and Spanish across these content areas for the different grade levels. So the presentation that I'm giving you today is going to report on genre-based similarities and differences across texts in English and Spanish. So just a little bit on SFL, it's been discussed a lot, but just to situate our study, we're using SFL as a framework because it has already made contributions to our understanding of disciplinary language, such as in O'Halloran's work, Schlepper-Groll's work, which was mentioned, Christie's work. And this approach puts the focus on content, helping us to identify how language works to construct disciplinary knowledge. The linguistic theory also links, as was discussed before, language structure with social context. And so this enables us to analyze how these texts are constructing meaning within the context of school, in the language of schooling, and what those features look like. Also, just to note, this approach looks at language as a set of choices rather than rules, and it really is all about making meaning for the particular genre or the particular content area. So the data sources included prominently used elementary textbooks, as I said, in language arts, math, science, social studies, in both English and Spanish. We were looking at textbooks used in 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, or probably around 12 to 15 years, that children would be 12 to 15 at these age levels. So the textbooks that we're using come from the South Florida region. They actually come from two of some of the largest districts in the US, and currently are being used in 18 dual language programs in Palm Beach County and 35 dual language programs in Broward County. Our DOS analysis focused on content analysis of the textbooks. Our unit of analysis was on the unit in a textbook and then looking within the unit for the theme and different themes that were picked up in that unit. Our analysis was guided by focus on 2 metafunctions, ideational. As you can see, they're listed are the different aspects, processes, participants. These are, in other words, verbs, nouns, prepositional phrases and other phrases, and conjunctions. The textual metafunction was looking at the cohesiveness and the coherence of the text, so looking at theme and reference, meaning pronouns, articles, and even the use of words throughout text. And after this analysis, we were interested, as I mentioned before, to compare and contrast across, so that we can learn about academic language, but also for the different grade levels across different content areas in English and Spanish. Just to show you what these textbooks look like, you can see that they are mirror texts, and what that means is that the original version of the text is in English, like the United States for social studies, and then the Spanish version of the text was created after that to map on and mirror exactly in format and content what was included in the English version. Okay. So finding 1, in both English and Spanish, academic language is a formal, specialized register that differs from informal social uses of everyday language. This is information that we are quite familiar with, just to provide you with some of the characteristics of everyday language versus academic language. And the part that I would like to highlight here is the generalized, specialized, and technical use of vocabulary, also the complex participant groups that we find in academic language, and this was consistent across English and Spanish, as well as the variety of sentence types. But I want to hone in a little bit about the difference that we noticed in English and Spanish academic language, which one of them was the technicality and tier of processes. So if we see in the first example, it says looks like, and it says, have you ever seen a rock that looks like an animal or plant? So the translation here is pareciera. And pareciera, if we think about the cognate in English, is appear. Or could have, and for example, in English, it could have been resembles, right? For it to be a higher tier vocabulary term. So what we're finding is that in the Spanish text, processes or verbs tend to have be more technical when compared to their English pair, and represent a higher tier of vocabulary. We see this also in, for example, the blowing sand wears away the softer rock. The translation is se desplaza. So se desplaza has a cognate in English too, which is to displace itself, to displace being higher tier than wears away. And again, with the last example, gets, right? The Copper Canyon gets its name. So in the Spanish example, recibe, the cognate would be receive, which would be a higher tier than get. So just something interesting that we're noticing. We also notice differences in the use of circumstances in Spanish, meaning prepositional phrases, versus just noun groups. So the example in English is Mexico has other natural landmarks. If we look at the Spanish text, it says otros puntos de referencia naturales. So in order to make that a pair, the Spanish, by nature of the way that the language is organized, uses prepositional phrases to attribute that description. And so what this means is that emergent to advanced bilingual students who are working through English and Spanish, some who come to the classroom with more knowledge in one versus the other, those Spanish dominant bilingual students may be more adept at understanding and isolating participant groups because they are faced with the task of finding or at least isolating the participant group that contains that preposition, that prepositional phrase. So at least, in the very least, it is a task that emergent to advanced bilinguals are called on to engage in more often. And so you can understand how this could really help to bolster their metalinguistic awareness. Another example of differences is theme and rime, or the provision of new information versus given information, also the relationship between the phrases within a sentence. What we notice is that there is more variability in Spanish with the order of processes, participants, and circumstances or adverbial groups. Here's an example. The English on the right-hand side says, it takes a long time for these natural landmarks to be created. And the Spanish says, estos puntos de referencia naturales tardan mucho tiempo en crearse. So if we were going to translate that to English, it would be literally, natural landmarks take a long time to create themselves. So here we're dealing with two aspects. The first is that the actual nature of Spanish and the use of reflexive and that being available in Spanish authentically is structured differently than in English. And then what this tells our emergent to advanced bilingual students is to expect is that in Spanish, academic language is much more variable. We can shift around the phrases and clauses, rather than in English, less variability is seen, and obviously we can sort of insight into that can be then made by the teacher. Just for time's sake, I'm going to move on. So finding 2, the academic language used in the content areas is structured and organized in discipline-specific ways, particular to each content area. So we found this in English and Spanish. Remember that these are mirror texts, so this is not highly surprising. But just to note, for example, language of science uses very technical words that both are unique to science, but are also everyday words that now have a different meaning indexed, such as hypothesizes, test, weight, results. We also see a lot of normalizations that are referencing information that was discussed previously. We see long, complex noun groups with a lot of, again, descriptors connected to the participant or the noun. I'm sorry. And then in terms of the thematic development, we see Onisha planned an investigation called an experiment. Outside of science, science experimenting means in science an experiment is. So that term is picked up and then expanded upon throughout the text. This is just to give you a different snapshot. So what we saw here was science. What we're going to see here is history or social studies. Here we see a lot more descriptive language being used. For example, 5 or similar types of landforms. We also see references being made and the connections between the words and the phrases. So areas within a region becomes they. Next. Geographic regions is picked up throughout. And then vegetation is also. And then definitions embedded. The way that the text really teaches, how it is instructional in nature, is through embedding the definitions. So we see a region is, a climate is, the 5 geographic regions are. And so we see the use of a relational process or the to be verb to use to index that definition. The difference that we saw across English and Spanish academic language was the use of reference. So in these two texts, we see that it's talking about the court system. It says, courts play an important part in our cities and towns. In Spanish, it's los tribunales, which references courts. The next sentence in English says, courtroom trials can have a lot of drama. So the connection between those two sentences there was made by the root word of court. But if we look at the Spanish, that's not available because, in fact, trials is a different word completely. It's los juicios. And so there we see an embedded clause que se realizan en los tribunales in order to make that connection back to los tribunales. And in fact, embedded clauses are often used in Spanish to expand upon and provide more information, and that is a specific difference. We also see the use of reference, just again in the nature of Spanish, where we see the use of a participant, alguien, meaning someone, and then se lo acusa, someone accused him. So there's two references there back to that same alguien, someone. And we don't see this in English because there is no, there does not need to be an object has been accused of. We can use the passive tense in order to signify without naming who did that. The other point here is notice that there is a second law. So law is a way in which to reference back. Students in academic language, learning Spanish academic language have to understand that law does not mean the same referent every time. And so that is something very particular to Spanish academic language. Finding 3 is access to the ways in which knowledge is constructed in the content areas. So just basically, I've highlighted here all of the terminology that seemingly looks like everyday language, but in fact is connected to very technical ideas. Also notice that we have in the sentence, the fence costs $5 for each meter. In the Spanish version, it says por metro. So it doesn't say por cada metro, which would be each. And instead, por, these students would have to understand that por means per here, and not by, and not for, which are some of the other translations of that preposition. So the point is that in each language, there are specific and technical aspects that need to be learned systematically or specifically. Okay, so I'm going to just cover what I was talking about here. So finding 4 talks about similarities that we would want teachers to really bring out of the text, similarities in terms of cognates, morphology, and then other aspects of word order. There are also differences that can be done with teachers that teachers can highlight. So vocabulary translations when there are no cognates for those words, or the ways that morphology differs between and also word order aspects. And basically, the discussion that we hope that this brings to light is that looking at the academic language across languages in the content areas is going to provide some insight into how teachers can be more specific towards the language features of the text that they're working with for their students. Obviously, we showed how similarities and differences could be highlighted or differentiated, and hopefully this is going to push teachers away from using those vocabulary strategies or the keyword strategies that really do not provide equitable access to content knowledge, and also of how to produce language that represents content knowledge appropriately. The last point that's quite important is we'd like to shift the dialogue from a focus of language demands of text, which is important in and of itself, but also to include and to consider the language affordances of emergent to advanced bilinguals and what they bring, the metalinguistic awareness that they bring, the knowledge of language that they bring with them to the classroom, use that as a foundation to get technical with language. So, thank you.
Just 2 minutes for questions. Any question or comment?
I think over here.
Oh, sorry.
Just a practical question about how it works. So students are expected to study the same topics in English and in Spanish? So the teacher repeats the same teacher? No.
So again, remember that these are being used across dual language programs, 1835. It's quite a number. Every dual language program follows slightly different rules and affordances given staffing and such. So in the one school that I've seen, content is not covered in the same way. So if they've covered one chapter in that classroom, they'll cover another chapter in the other classroom. But it differs. It really can be very variable given the resources that they have and the structure and things like that. So it would be interesting to know how the texts are worked with, or how teachers work with the texts in the different programs. Yeah.
Another question?
You mentioned that the students can bring their own resources to the classroom. So would you advocate an approach in which students explicitly discuss metalinguistically differences between English and Spanish, Spanish and English? Is that part of the approach?
Yes, for sure. That is definitely driving that approach, helping teachers not to be afraid of the technicalities, and also trying to open up that conversation of that's what content-area teachers need to do. That is part of their responsibility. It's not just an add-on. Language is part of their job. Luciana de Oliveira gives a lot of different workshops on SFL, and that's really her piece there.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, good morning on my behalf as well, and thank you, Anna and Tom, for inviting me to have this moment to share my thoughts about this morning. Very interesting papers, and as you realize, saying something specific of 5 papers in 10 minutes is not doable, so I will move the discussion in a more general level and try to look at the overarching themes that, in my view, emerge across these different presentations. And something that I think quite clearly has come up throughout these different presentations is this idea of the need and the necessity to rethink language, content, and the relationship, be it in immersion, content-based instruction, or CLIL. So, as we have seen, language is approached as a meaning-making system, foregrounding meaning, as Tom said in the introduction, and also that language learning, the way we need to look at language learning is something that is inherently tied to subject areas. I think this message has come quite clearly across different presentations. Something that I also liked a lot was that there were these dichotomies mentioned, but those were not the main concern in any presentation. So language, content, form, function, product, process. I think this idea seemed to be coming through, that all of these are seen as important parts when we deal with language as social and functional phenomenon. So to me, what I'm seeing here is researchers here adopting a complex and holistic view of language that recognizes ambiguities, probabilities, uncertainties, and co-presence of different forms of dimensions: linguistics, discursive, social, and cultural. And then what I think would be interesting would be to juxtapose this need towards some kind of not rules but principles, and then sort of to put it against this idea of ambiguities and co-presence of different dimensions. I couldn't resist doing a bit of advertising here, even though Tom and Anna already mentioned the new book that has just come out. So what is at stake here also is very much this discussion around the relationship between content and language from SFL, but also other functional perspectives. Something that I have found very appealing throughout this morning's presentations is the way these papers have advanced theorizing in this field. Theorizing a relationship between language and content. Drawing ideas from systemic functional linguistics, but as Anna was mentioning in the introduction, also other areas of study, usage-based linguistics, legitimation code theory, speech theory, task-based learning, and so on. And I think such theory building is crucially important in the field because on the one hand it creates new meta-language to make sense of the role of language in learning, which, as we have seen throughout, is far from an easy matter. We really need new tools and new meta-language. And I think, Angel, it was you who brought up this issue of meta-language and the need to create new forms of it. But theory building is very important also from analytical perspective because we need to all the time be on the lookout for better tools to tackle content and language integration as an empirical question. I've often confronted this in my own research when I have data transcripts of classroom interaction. And I try to see what is content specific, what counts as content specific language in that data. So I think we need to develop better tools to tackle those areas. And finally, I think there have been many insights presented here that can offer a lot to practice. What can we do to develop bilingual education and teaching in practice? I already mentioned this offering new meta-language, not just for research, but also practitioners to sort of raise their awareness of the interconnectedness of language and content. And I think semantic waves and this notion of unpacking and repacking information, for example, can be probably very useful tools to teachers. And I also have found it important and interesting that the importance of interpersonal aspects of language has been brought alongside knowledge transfer. And for example, voice appraisal being examples of that. And then I think what the practitioners also need in terms of awareness raising is guiding their attention towards this idea of language being patterned, schematized, and the fact that it's patterned and schematized in subject-specific ways. And cognitive discourse functions, registers, and genres have been some examples of that. So, basically, to recap, I think it's been very interesting morning, and I think the presentations in a nice way are reflecting the ongoing changes in the research field, which could be described as moving from seeing language as a decontextualized, essentialized entity to be learned in its own right, to seeing it as deeply contextualized and inherent in knowledge construction and display in any subject. I have sometimes used these funnels to sort of, in a simplified manner, to illustrate how the focus and the gaze of researchers, I think, is not forgetting the first one. I'm not saying that we should forget structures, words, and text, but alongside that focus, look at genres, registers, and how language is specific for each subject. And as a very final note, something that I've been thinking all along when listening to these interesting papers is that we are talking here now from the perspective of CLIL, bilingual education, immersion education, but I think what we're talking about in general terms is the role of language in learning. So the message conveyed here is very pertinent to education in general. And I think we as researchers in the bilingual education areas have a very good message to bring to educational researchers in general. Kiitos, as we say in Finland. Thank you.
And all the presenters could please go to the front and please use microphones if you would. This is time here now for a large group discussion, so people can ask additional questions and offer their comments. I'll just say, by the way, that the picture of the book that Tadia showed a couple slides ago is one of the books that's up for the raffle. Okay, some questions from the group, some comments to get the discussion rolling.
So my comment is for Tarias, because you nicely summed up this, but I'm a bit surprised by the last slide when you say that the discussion reflects this move from seeing language as being this totally decontextualized thing, and we're moving now towards seeing it as more contextualized. I mean, that's not a new idea. We've been doing that for a very long time.
Okay, but yes, I completely agree, and I didn't maybe put myself clearly in that respect. I'm not saying that this is something that emerges here only, but I think that this is a good representation of that sort of a development of that, or one, how should I say, an indication of that movement. So.
So I'm not an immersion educator. I work in higher education context, post-secondary context, but I've followed the work of Heidi Burns for a long time. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the implications of this research is for your specific context. A lot of what Heidi's worked on has been sort of using SFL as a way to think about language and content together, to think about the language-content divide that's inherent in foreign language programs in US institutions of higher education, and also to think about how to create holistic curricula. So I wonder what the contribution is of this kind of research that's grounded in SFL for thinking about immersion, dual language education, CLIL, and all that kind of stuff, sort of larger implications.
Do you have to turn it on? Oh yeah. What comes to my mind immediately is something that actually moves us away from immersion, dual language, and bilingual education, really to foreign language education. And I see development there, certainly in Europe, in the national curricula, to well, in the wake of the communicative paradigm, to foregrounding oral sort of everyday interaction and communication, and the learning goals that are formulated are very much on the level of interpersonal everyday interactions of BICS type of things, ousting content areas that were very well established and they're now not so fashionable earlier days of so-called grammar translation method. And I think we're seeing a bit of a dearth of content actually there. So what I take from this work that I have been part of is that we also need to start talking to the language educators specifically and encourage them to bring back the content into the foreign language or into the second language classroom.
Something that I could go on from there. I think one important message from this kind of research would be the general education in terms of curriculum development, or rather the way curricula are implemented in practice. And I'm talking about the very current situation in Finland, in the Finnish context, we have just received our new core curriculum for general education. And in the curriculum text, the role of language is now more visible than before. So there's quite a lot of talk about every teacher being language teacher, and language. There's demand for language-sensitive schools. But then what I have heard from many schools and teachers, and especially from content teachers who are not bilingual teachers as such, asking, what does this mean? In what sense am I also a language teacher? So I think this kind of research can help provide tools for helping schools figure out their orientation to this whole idea of being language sensitive.
I have a comment in regard of semantic waves. It seems to me that all this learning goes through up and down, or the packing and packing in a teacher-guided practice until the scholar is functional as his own, until the higher levels of the languages it's acquiring. And please correct me if I'm wrong. That's what I understood, and these waves of that you mentioned in a graph. Yes, it's just a comment that I understood that it's going up and down of these waves. It's a teacher-guided practice with the scholars, and then at the end of your graph, it shows that the growth of the scholar and with its function more independent without a teacher. That's what I understood.
Yeah, the wave pattern is an idealized practice, and in the classrooms that we have analyzed, it's usually quite flat or dropping without rising. So, but yeah, I think your understanding is in line with my understanding of that. Yeah.
I have actually two questions. One question is, how does your research connect to neuroscience, the study of the brain? And this goes for anybody. And then the second question is, how does your research impact English language development program models, where there is a wide practice in teaching language, meaning the structures of the language, in isolation of content? I don't know those.
I'll go for the second one. Okay, so this is related to Christiane's point about how we need to think about the role of an English teacher now. I mean, the English teacher, the foreign language teacher, the second language teacher. And I'm thinking of our own context where teachers are seeing all this research carried out with content teachers, trying to get them to see the role of language in teaching content and how to integrate both. And then they come to us and say, what about us? What shall we do now? What is our role? Shall we continue teaching the way we've always taught? Or, because they have a feeling that also it's a question of feeling that their role as language teachers is at risk if we argue that the best way to learn a second language or a foreign language is through content. So there is a lot to do there. And we were talking, Tom and I, when we were working on this presentation, that we really need to go now back to the English teachers and work with them and try to find ways of getting them to see that the role of as language teachers is also relevant, because what can you tell them? So I don't know if anybody else would like to.
Yeah, I'd like to just follow on from that, because I think don't get me wrong, I think communicative language teaching is a good thing, but the consequence it has had is, I think, that language teachers have lost confidence or even awareness of their content specialization, namely language. So this kind of taboo on talking about language, making language the object of study also, not only the tool for communication, that is, I think, part of what's part of the course that language teachers are becoming sort of nervous about. So what are we gonna do? And that's not going to be the whole solution. Also, sort of doing explicit language teaching or reflecting about language again. But I think it could be part of not of a solution, but of a new path, taking a new fork on the path to better language teaching.
I'll try to address the first question, because in my faculty they just set up a neuroscience lab, and we have a chair professor in neuroscience, and she's going to give a seminar. I think the meta-linguistic awareness that we have been talking about, the going for the language analysis as a strategy for both content teachers and language teachers, rather than just general strategies. So I think this will have an impact on our neural wiring, and also emergent bilinguals, advanced bilinguals, but being more metalinguistically aware, because we constantly have to analyze language systems and language resources, that our brain functions have been more enriched, maybe. Okay, I'm no expert in neuroscience.
Can I just add to that? That reminds me of something that our plenary said yesterday, that constant engagement in activity changes the brain. So if you're constantly engaged in reflection on language and metalinguistic reflection and using language meaningfully, but at the same time being asked to think about what you're actually doing in terms of language, it must have some effect on the brain. Yeah.
So I work with a lot of teachers who teach through a content area in a dual language program. And a common question I get from my practitioners is, what's the balance of the explicit language instruction or reflection, as you just mentioned, and content, especially because some of the research you mentioned about the differences between students who are performing well in their L2 and then may not have the same level of content knowledge, and then all those different variables of different types of students with their different proficiencies in both content and language. So what would you recommend, based on your research, to a practitioner for the balance of reflecting on language and then instructing the content?
I'll speak to that. So I think instead of thinking about the balance as, is it 50-50, right? As in an answer that provides them with some avenue, I would say that using SFL, thinking about SFL as a theory that helps us to understand language, its use, and then the relationship to content, it's more about purpose. That's, I think, for me, the border. So what is the purpose of the language and the text that they're looking at? And how much can we talk about, okay, your understanding of the text, of the information that the text is providing you. So where are you getting that information from? Let's talk about it. What is being, how is the information being developed? And what linguistic aspects show us that? I think thinking about it in those terms, having those types of conversations, it's going to push us away from this arbitrary question of, so where's the balance? Because it should be connected is the point. It's always going to be connected. And if it's not, then really you might not be doing a meaningful job in either language or content.
To add to that, reflections from the workshops yesterday that offered, if you have a pedagogy for integrating content and language, which is principled, it may vary in terms of, we saw yesterday in the workshops, Laurent and Roy's and other ones that are available. But if you have a pedagogy, then you move away from the idea of balance in terms of some time for language, whatever language is supposed to be, and some time for content, whatever content is supposed to be. And that pedagogy can be quite flexible, as we saw in Roy's. someone asked about how much time do you spend on the noticing, how much time do you spend on, but that depends on the context, depends on your aims. But you get away then from the idea of balance being kind of like two solitudes, you know, some language work here, then some content work there, but we bring it all together if we have a pedagogy.
I'd like to add to it with Pauline Gibbons' notion of spontaneous scaffolding and design scaffolding. So spontaneous or interactive scaffolding, that is, you don't plan to focus attention on the language, but in the interaction, the teacher, given the context, judges that specific attention needs to be given to a certain language aspect during the delivery of the content. That would be spontaneous interactive scaffolding. Design scaffolding is, we can actually systematically build in the balancing of the attention to content and attention to language, because Christina has mentioned the integration means pedagogical focus. That is, when to draw students' attention to content, when to draw attention to language. So this pedagogical focus can be designed, systematically planned, or spontaneous as the need arises in the interaction.
I think that is a lovely final comment. I think we're out of time. Unless you want, was there one more question over here? No? We're out of time. Thank you so much for a stimulating morning. I certainly enjoyed it, and I know others did as well. We have lunch either on the 4th floor or the 2nd floor, depending upon your name tag. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I want to do advertising. You can email me. I'll send you an e-copy of the book. It just came out last week.
Sorry, one quick thank you to Diane and Roy for having invited us to run this symposium. Thanks very much.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Thanks for coming.